Good morning. My name is Chris Deeves, and my presentation is entitled Megachurches and the Nairobi Statement: How Cultural Should Worship Be? It was born out of my final year of study at the Robert E. Weber Institute for Worship Studies, or IWS, and was based on a topic assigned by my professor, Dr. Pedrito Maynard-Reed, who's responsible for teaching the course Cross-Cultural Perspectives in Christian Worship. I'm indebted to IWS, to President Dr. Jim Hart, to Academic Dean Donnell Franklin, and all the faculty, staff, and students for creating a true community. In order to stay within the time frame allotted, I needed to edit my paper considerably, and I only have time to delve into two of the four main points, omitting discussions on how or if non-denominational megachurches are transcultural, and if they are countercultural. As much as possible, I've tried to maintain the main point, often sacrificing supporting research in favor of my own experiences from my context to help demonstrate the results of creating a church based on non-denominational megachurch models, which points back to the overall question in the title, which is how cultural should worship be? This presentation today really only scratches the surface, and hopefully it will stir you to ask some relevant questions of your own context. Let's begin. Lakeside Church was founded in 1989 in the city of Guelph, Ontario, Canada. The founders of Lakeside wanted to follow a new model, and the choice was made to be non-denominational, a movement that did not really fully emerge until the mid-20th century. Relatively new megachurch Willow Creek Community Church from the Chicago suburb of South Barrington soon became and emerged as a leader in the non-denominational church movement. And leaders of Lakeside really made the decision at that point to base Lakeside Church on the Willow Creek Community Church model of ministry. Willow Creek founder Bill Hybels and Andy Stanley of the newly founded non-denominational and soon-to-be megachurch North Point Church became the leaders to pay attention to, with Stanley's book Deep and Wide literally becoming a blueprint for ministry at Lakeside. I was hired in Lakeside in 2006 as the Director of Creative Arts. In 1996, a few years after the launch of Lakeside Church, a statement was published by the Lutheran World Federation simply titled The Nairobi Statement on Worship and Culture. This statement asserts the following: Christian worship relates dynamically to culture in at least four ways. First, it is transcultural, same substance for everyone everywhere, beyond culture. Second, it is contextual. It varies according to the local situation, both nature and culture. Third, it is countercultural, changing what is contrary to the gospel in a given culture. And fourth, it is cross-cultural. It makes possible sharing between different local cultures. This paper, our presentation, is a brief historical examination of the relationship between non-denominational megachurches and two of the four main points of the Nairobi Statement and the effects of creating a church following the megachurch models. So looking first at worship as contextual in non-denominational worship. The Nairobi Statement articulates that in the mystery of Jesus' incarnation are the model and the mandate for the contextualization of Christian worship. Culture, as defined by Pedrito Maynard-Reed, includes everything that is passed on, experienced, and practiced. In short, everything that is part of one's social heritage and environment. Just as we cannot live without the Earth's atmosphere, we cannot live apart from culture. The non-denominational megachurch movement was founded on the idea of connecting with current culture. The words relevant and contextual are buzzwords for these churches, having spawned an entire genre of writings and study on culture and how to properly engage it. This relentless desire to be contextually contemporary drives non-denominational megachurches. Due to the fact that non-denominational churches are not tied to one particular liturgy, the components can and do vary week to week, location to location, with each church trying to find the best way to have a relevant gathering. To properly discuss all the ways in which non-denominational megachurches employ the approach and the idea of contextualization is beyond the scope of this paper and presentation, I've selected specific areas that have created the most impact and often the most criticisms. The Nairobi Statement shares two distinct methods wherein worship can be contextual: dynamic equivalence and creative assimilation. I will discuss these two areas separately in the following sections. Looking first at dynamic equivalence. The Nairobi Statement defines dynamic equivalence as re-expressing components of Christian worship with something from a local culture that has an equal meaning, value, and function. The Nairobi Statement is also clear to share that extreme care needs to be taken when considering introducing an item in this way, as not everything can be integrated with Christian worship. Elements borrowed from local culture should always undergo critique and purification. When looking at non-denominational megachurches, there are two main areas where dynamic equivalence has occurred: architecture or space and music. The way in which non-denominational megachurches approached church architecture was mainly via pragmatism, intentionally avoiding tradition. It is worth noting that the architecture changes that non-denominational megachurches made were deeply and intrinsically linked to the non-denominational megachurch dynamic equivalence approach to music, which I'll examine after this. Firstly, the non-denominational megachurch movement is based on connecting with populist culture. So decisions were made to abandon the old look of church and attract new people. James K. Smith's observations on this topic are both insightful and critical of this movement. Smith writes, "Rather than the daunting, spooky atmosphere of the Gothic cathedral, we invite people to worship in the ethos of the coffee shop, the concert hall, or the mall. We distill Jesus out of the inherited ancient forms of historic worship, which we will discard as traditional, in order to present Jesus in forms that are both fresh and familiar. Come meet Jesus in the sanctified experience of the coffee shop. Come hear the gospel in a place that should feel familiar, since it's modeled after the mall." The problem, of course, is that these forms are not just neutral containers or discardable conduits for a message. The forms themselves are pedagogies of desire that teach us to construe and relate to the world in a loaded way. The liturgy of the mall is a heart-level education in consumerism that construes everything as a commodity available to make me happy. When I encounter Jesus in such a liturgy, I am implicitly being taught that Jesus is one more commodity available to make me happy. The non-denominational megachurch movement was founded on using contemporary music styles as well. And Brian Chappell notes that this was a great way to connect with culture. And Chappell writes this: "The worship music echoes secular trends, making the church seem less odd for the unchurched and less remote for everyday life for those who have found their church's music traditions stale. For many people who felt that they cannot authentically participate in traditional worship because it's not resonant with their lives outside of church, contemporary worship styles have been a blessed path into or back to corporate worship." It really cannot be overstated how important and linked the relationship between secular popular music development and the development of non-denominational megachurch worship music is. The value of relevance became the guiding principle that worship leaders would strive for every week. People responded to this type of non-denominational mega worship style, and the need came to design even larger auditoriums, paving the way for the concert hall style church, complete with stage lighting, sets, and a full stage. The megachurch was born. My experience at Lakeside regarding space and music again mirrored the megachurch model. The Lakeside building was built in a very pragmatic, utilitarian way. The building was added onto several times while I worked there, including a 1,000-seat auditorium complete with a raised stage and stage lighting, lacking any windows and lacking a permanent cross. The contemporary rock band music during the gathering was loud intentionally and made it almost impossible to hear yourself sing, let alone people beside you or around you. The lighting was intentionally left low in the room during the music to help facilitate engagement, apparently done more easily if people don't feel like they were part of a large group. The atrium was adorned with chairs and couches and TVs, and you could also watch the gathering in the cafe, which served coffee and offered small tables a la Starbucks. It was modeled on the mall or the cafe in every way, built for convenience and efficiency. The second aspect of this is creative assimilation. In the Nairobi Statement, creative assimilation is defined as adding pertinent components of local culture to the liturgical ordo in order to enrich its original core. Again, as with dynamic equivalence, the Nairobi Statement urges that care be taken to properly critique an item before it's added into the liturgy. Non-denominational megachurches often employ various methods of creative assimilation, but by far the most controversial is the use of secular music in worship gatherings. Non-denominational megachurches, as described above, were on the cutting edge of using music in the contextualization method of dynamic equivalence. So this meant employing modern forms and musical styles, mainly using songs that were written expressly for the use in worship services in this new modern style. So given this connection already, it's easy to understand the desire of non-denominational megachurches to use secular songs in worship, since the new worship music they were already using aesthetically sounded similar and was structured the same way. For non-denominational megachurches, the desire to use secular songs was again driven by the need to be culturally relevant in society and to holding people's attention, grabbing them with something that they might not expect in church. As Nancy Beach, the founding creative arts director at Willow Creek Community Church, states, the church has a reputation of being one of the most boring ways a person can spend an hour. The goal of worship planning, according to Beach, is for people to drive away from an hour on Sunday morning saying, they kept my interest the whole time. Leaders must spot and intercept entropy early, long before anyone else notices, and the yawning commences. This mindset of holding people's attention eventually morphed into keeping people entertained. Instead of shying away from this concept, non-denominational megachurches embraced and promoted it, often crafting this idea into their values, as Andy Stanley did at North Point, where their immediate goal is when a regular attendee brings an unchurched friend who enjoys the service so much that he or she returns the following week. If the unchurched friend returns the following Sunday with another unchurched friend in tow, we break out the champagne and hire a band. This is why using secular music became appealing to non-denominational megachurches, as it attracted people, hopefully causing them to invite others to come and see what might happen at church. I had a 180 on this topic while I was at Lakeside. When I joined Lakeside in 2001, I loved that they used secular music in the gatherings. I personally was involved in songs by bands like Kansas, Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, the Eagles, and the Beatles. It was always argued that it was a way to connect with non-believers, to show them that we live in the same world that they do, and a great inviting tool. My journey took me to IWS, and during my first on-campus session in 2016, I had an epiphany, resulting in a reversal of thinking on this subject. I was convicted and felt strongly that secular music did not have a place in worship gatherings. I returned home and talked to my pastor about this change of heart and shared my feelings about why I not only repented for what I had done, but why I no longer wanted our church to use secular music in gatherings. He understood, and Lakeside no longer used secular music for the next several years up until my departure. Many people would subsequently ask me why we stopped using secular songs, and I would share my own journey with them and would gently help them to see the dangers of creating a system of entertainment rather than of worship. Moving on to another section of the Nairobi Statement, worship as cross-cultural in non-denominational worship. This final Nairobi Statement section examines cross-cultural worship, defining it as, by virtue of baptism, there is really only one church, and one means of living in faithful response to baptism is to manifest ever more deeply the unity of the church. The sharing of hymns and art and other elements of worship across cultural barriers helps enrich the whole church. The Nairobi Statement clarifies that care should be taken that the music, art, architecture, gestures and postures, and other elements of different cultures are understood and respected when they're used by churches elsewhere in the world. That criteria for contextualization, which we've covered in the above section, should be observed. Non-denominational megachurches have historically been weak in the area of using cross-cultural worship elements in their gatherings. Rather, non-denominational megachurches have actually seen themselves as a cross-cultural worship content creator, aiming to share their brand of Christian worship with the world. In this way, they are often excited to share their ministry ideas and styles with other cultures all around the world. The main idea that non-denominational megachurches seek to be cross-cultural is in the creation of their own music, which they in turn expect other regions to employ as a cross-cultural element in their gatherings. In her landmark book on this topic, Monique Ingalls explores the ways in which the contemporary music style of modern worship music engages worshipers in a variety of performance spaces that were once distinct, bridging public and private devotional practices, connecting online and offline communities, and bringing competing personal, institutional, and commercial interest into the same domain. Essentially, music that was created initially to be used in worship gatherings became available to people privately through recordings, and by virtue of the business marketing of this music was spread much farther than the local congregation, literally becoming global music being sold around the world. Ingalls continues in this great quote, "Congregational music making is reconceived as a participatory religious musical practice capable of weaving together a religious community inside and outside institutional churches. Congregational music making is not only a means of expressing local concerns in constituting the local religious community, it is also a potent way to identify with far-flung individuals, institutions, and networks that comprise this global religious community." Great quote by Ingalls. Ingalls further shares that Christian communities worldwide sing English versions of translations as a globalized repertory produced and circulated by large transnational megachurches, as well as national and international Christian commercial recording industries. Although one could argue, and make a good argument, I might add, that this sounds more like modern musical colonialism than cross-culturalism, the fact remains that the music that was born out of the non-denominational megachurch movement has truly become global and is being used in a cross-cultural way in other cultural contexts. Kathy Black's definition of culturally conscious worship becomes helpful to bring us back towards the Nairobi Statement and its understanding of cross-cultural worship. Black defines culturally conscious worship in this way. The design of culturally conscious worship intentionally works with a consciousness of, 1, our multiracial, multi-ethnic, multicultural society and the world. 2, the cultural diversity, its gifts and its challenges present in the congregation. And 3, persons who experience living in the margins and living within inequity of power. Sadly, there is a real lack of substantial evidence to prove that non-denominational megachurches are cross-cultural in this way in their worship. My Lakeside experience and my IWS learning collided head-on during my final year of IWS and what turned out to be my final year at Lakeside. One assignment was to create 2 cross-cultural gatherings and actually enact one of them in your church on a Sunday morning. When I first broached the subject of a cross-cultural gathering to my pastor, he was extremely negative about it and threatened to not allow me to carry out the assignment. I did eventually create and facilitate a gathering which incorporated scripture reading in 3 languages, a guest worship leader and team from a Black church in our city, And our church is a very, very white church. So that was a big deal. And as part of the worship set, including a traditional Nigerian song, which was sung in both English and in African. But most of that gathering was highly criticized afterwards by my pastor. Lakeside leadership at the time, and likely now, has a clear target audience of young families who are predominantly upper middle class and white. So to kind of bring all this to a conclusion, the Nairobi Statement on Worship and Culture outlines four main ways. We've only looked at two today, but it outlines four main ways in which worship can relate dynamically to culture. Worship as transcultural, worship as contextual, worship as countercultural, and worship as cross-cultural. My research and my own contextual experience shows that if the spread of non-denominational megachurch models continues, there can be several unhealthy issues that grow, creating simultaneously a church model that can potentially be hyper-culturally focused, with potentially leading to highly narcissistic and internally focused worship, ministries, and congregations, which in turn break down as they defeat the very thing that they were intended to do, which is to be a Christ-centric worshiping community, loving and welcoming to all people. So all of this leads me to questions which I feel that we should be asking in our own contexts. Questions like, are megachurch worship models and cultural practices to be considered healthy worship? If yes, what aspects are healthy and can be assimilated? If not, why do these and other churches employ their methodologies? Also, the question of just how cultural should worship be? Do you think worship can be too cultural? Why or why not? Lastly, should the Nairobi Statement be a benchmark of measuring worship gatherings? Why or why not? All good questions. I'm sure there are many more that you've also been thinking about. I'm going to close my time now in prayer. Father, thank you for all these people, your children, who wish to learn and grow in their understanding regarding worship and culture. I pray that my words and ideas today would spark a desire to learn more and to prayerfully consider our worship practices in our contexts. Amen. Thank you very much.